This is Thrive Perspectives, an ever-growing discussion about the issues and ideas that shape our lives, with your guide, Dr. Matthew Jacoby.
Welcome, listeners, to this episode of Thrive Perspectives. It's Stu here, your host, and we're glad you joined us as we continue to discuss key aspects of the Christian worldview. Throughout history, laws have shaped societies, not just in governance, but in thought, ethics, and identity. One of the most influential legal codes in human history, the Mosaic Law, has often been viewed as a rigid list of rules governing every aspect of life. But is that the whole story? Could it be that the true purpose of these laws wasn't about legalism, but about instilling a worldview? What if it was designed to cultivate a paradigm, a way of thinking that would shape a people, a culture, and even future generations? In today's episode, Matt Connell and myself will explore how this ancient framework offered principles rather than mere prescriptions. We'll unpack how it was designed to guide moral reasoning, social justice, and communal responsibility, rather than just dictate external compliance. Furthermore, we'll examine the Mosaic Law in relation to other ancient Near Eastern legal codes, such as the Code of Hammurabi and the Hittite laws. How did they compare in their approach to justice, morality, and societal order? By exploring both the similarities and distinctions, we'll gain a deeper understanding of the Mosaic Law's unique purpose and lasting influence. So let's jump in with Matt and Connell as we take a closer look at key passages, historical contexts, and the real-world applications that reveal the deeper intent behind the Mosaic Law, moving beyond the letter and stepping into the spirit of the law. Morning, Matt. Good morning, Connell. Here we are. Thrive Perspectives. This is where we do our best to confuse everybody, including ourselves.
Yeah. Stuart and I are both confused.
Yeah, we're largely the ones that are confused. Matt seems to know where we're heading. But anyway, it's a great conversation and it's great to have you join us. We're actually going to continue a little bit with our theme over the last few episodes, really, Matt, aren't we? In terms of the relation of law, biblical ethics, what is the Bible and how should we be using it to inform our lives today? And sometimes that means perhaps digging a little bit into understanding what the Bible is and what the law is before we can actually say, therefore, how do we apply it to ourselves today? And I think that's part of the conversation we want to pick up.
Yeah, that's right.
Pick up today.
So it's interesting because this started with a conversation around some parts of the New Testament that talk about gender roles and that are a bit abrasive, I think, to the contemporary reader. Yeah. And that then led to sort of deeper questions because you can't just, because it seems straightforward, well, you should just do this. But, we made the point that, well, actually, we need to think about how we take those sort of things. And is the point about the Bible not being a rule book doesn't at all take away from the supreme authority of the Bible. But we need to understand that a lot of, letters are applications of biblical principles to particular situations. Yeah. And one of the things that we noted in one situation, Paul says, do this to embody this principle. And in a different situation, he says, do something quite contradictory. And so it's like, hang on, well, which one of those is going to actually apply here? And why do they even contradict in the first place? Well, the important thing is the theological principle undergirding that you need to go back to. And the great example of this is the Mosaic Law. And we're going to focus on the Mosaic Law.
Strap yourselves in.
Today. So I think the important thing is that there's always a why behind, even where we're explicitly given rules. So at no point have we said the Bible doesn't contain rules.
No, that's right.
But it's important to recognize the Bible isn't a rule book. It's a narrative of God's dealings with his people. It's God showing us who he is and who we are and what his will is for our lives. Okay, so... And part of that is that he doesn't just want us to be kind of sort of mindless rule followers, right? We're called to embody, to be certain kinds of people, right? And God is shaping us into certain kinds of people. I think that's the important theme there. And, even a list of rules like the 10 Commandments, each of those is based on very important principles. You shall not murder is based on the principle of this sanctity of life. And yet, in that we go to the Mosaic Law, and there are actually instructions to kill as well as not kill in certain circumstances. It's just like, hang on.
Yeah.
If life is sacred, and then there's a question is, so if it says that this person should be stoned, should we then apply that today? Because that's what it said. And I don't think you can just say, it's just Old Testament. That's very problematic, just dismissing the whole of the Old Testament when Jesus explicitly said, I've not come to remove one stroke from the law. You can't just dismiss it like that. Each of those applications is working in a particular context to build something in that context that's intelligible within that context.
Yes.
So I think that's really
But that then
important.
shapes those people into being what God wants them to be. It helps them become the people God wants them to be, as you said in the previous episode. And just before we jump into this, which may perhaps for some people feel kind of complex and, perhaps challenging as well, which I'd say it has been for me as we've looked at this particular topic. Can I just kind of give a little bit of an analogy as I was thinking as you were saying this? Many of us are parents, and all of us in this room are, and you as a listener may be a parent. I can remember telling one of my sons, you can't steal your brother's pocket money from his piggy bank. Now, the point is, it wasn't only about him not taking the money from the piggy bank. It was about not stealing. And it was like trying to sow into him the fact that you shouldn't take things that don't belong to you. Now, I had to say something specific that felt like a rule for that situation, for that moment in time. But it was much more about, we don't steal. What's not yours is not yours. And my hope is that as he's grown up, he understands that that's the principle by which we shape our lives.
Yeah, and yet, and even for that, there's a deeper principle around our trust in God and who we're called to be. We're called to be givers of blessing, right? A people who bless, and part of blessing is giving out. It's the fragmented humanity, each person trying to live autonomously, that has people grasping for themselves and trying to have more than that person. And so there's a theological principle underlying even the law, you shall not steal, and so you could go through the 10 Commandments and see those there as embodiments of theological principles that are laid down. Mainly, in fact, the first 2 chapters of Genesis are so important. We've been covering this, Stu, in the Thrive Deeper episode, and I'd encourage listeners to
search that up
because I think those chapters are so vital. They really lay the core groundwork for, our relationships with God and each other and so forth that underlies a lot of the instructions in the Bible.
Before we jump in here, maybe unpack what the Mosaic Law is for those who perhaps don't. We could make a whole lot of assumptions here. So when we use the term the Mosaic Law, what are we?
Okay, so what we do, we are going to have a look at the Law of Moses, or the Mosaic Law, which is contained in book of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The laws are sort of scattered throughout there. Now, the reason we're going to look at this is because we have alluded to this in the past few episodes, because they illustrate the paradigmatic nature. I'll explain that in a moment. They illustrate the fact that these instructions are applications of principles to particular situations.
Right.
And the situations are already very complex. And essentially what these laws are is the best way forward from a situation that's already bad in most cases. Right?
Okay, that's great.
So it's very difficult. And this is where, opponents of the Bible love to dig these laws out and say, you see, it advocates slavery. Well, no, it actually does amazing things in the context of the ancient world to counter something already broken.
Yeah.
It's actually amazing. So I think it's just worth us having a look at this to give examples of how this works, because essentially in the letters in the New Testament, there are very similar things happening where there's a particular context and certain things occurring. Paul, for example, writes to a church or a group of churches, and he's trying to counter a problem that's occurring in that church. And he wants to uphold a biblical principle. And in one church, he'll say one thing to uphold that biblical principle. In another church, he'll say another thing to uphold it, because it depends on the differing circumstances. So while the instructions will be different, the principle that they're based on remains the same. We're not wishy-washying around the place. This is not kind of relativism. It's a little bit situational.
So it's
how it
getting
works.
behind the don't steal from your brother's piggy bank to what's the big principle sitting underneath that.
Yeah,
Is kind
that's
of what
right.
you're saying.
Well,
Yeah.
it's trying to find principle, or you're trying to find a way around the rules so you can take from your brother's piggy bank. I could become really rule-based and try to look at the rule and go, how could I work my way around this in order to justify that? But I think we want to dig beyond the rule to understand the principle, because it's ultimately the principle that God's trying to teach us.
That's right. That was the problem that we see behind a lot of Jesus' corrections of Jewish interpretations of the law in the Gospels. So he's, in many, many cases, addressing situations by telling them, you've got the principle wrong.
Yeah.
Because they filled in all the gaps.
But were
So-
they even interested in what the principle
Well,
was?
a lot of it was, there were a lot of loopholes. They created a lot of loopholes because for them, and I think this is a really important point to make about the law big picture, like the commandments, is that they were not primarily a way of being made right. They were primarily a way of showing us how and when we go wrong. But a lot of what we're going to look today is also that these are laws governing community life.
Yeah.
And there are lots of these in the New Testament. You know, how do we guard community life? How do we uphold principles? Because we are a church community in a world that's watching us. So we need to be intelligible to that world. We don't want to push these principles too far, right? You know, so Peter, for example, is concerned that, everyone's thinking that there's going to be a slave revolt, right? Because in the Christian churches, slaves are treated equal to masters. They're sitting, eating around the same table. It was enormously important symbolism expressed there. And so people are thinking, whoa, this is a brewing slave revolt. If slaves start getting this picture that they're, equal to everyone else, then we're in for trouble. So Peter says, listen, slaves, this is what I want you to do for the sake of the witness. I want you to submit to masters, even masters who treat you harshly. Wow. Like it just, and you could take that out of isolation and think, oh, that's terrible. That's a terrible thing to ask of a slave.
Yeah.
But in the context, it makes perfect sense. And he says, because you know what? Jesus bore suffering unjustly for the sake of the gospel, and we need to be prepared to do the same. So there is the principle at work under there. But if you just isolate it out of context, it sounds terrible.
But if you're actually looking to attack Christianity, your motivation for doing that isn't really to dig into the principle. It's to try to make focuses just on the wording of the law. And that's where there's a motivation
This is why it's
behind it.
problematic, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, and we can fall into that trap. I mean, that example that you just gave there with, slaves and our reaction to that law, I mean, that's my reaction to so many of those laws. I mean, they read really badly. In fact, often I've thought, thanks God, you've basically deposited this hand grenade from the ancient world into our modern context.
3,500 years ago.
These things don't read well in our culture.
Yeah.
And it's like, sometimes I think, surely there was a better way of doing this, like instead of giving us this laws that, they don't read well. It's like having a bomb,
Well, it
like
depends.
a hot potato dropped into our hands. And it's like, well, what do I do with this? Like, how am I supposed to defend this,
Well, I'm thankful for them because they give us permission to give a fairly messy solution to a messy situation.
Yeah.
I'm actually very grateful for the messiness of the Mosaic Law because there are plenty of very complex situations that I face. Like when you're wading through the tangled swamp of life in this world, layers of complexity, just applying a simplistic biblical law it's just, you can't do that, So you have to ask the question, okay, what is the most constructive step forwards into God's purpose from this situation that is going to be intelligible within that situation? And so it gives us permission actually to recognize the complexity and not feel like we have to come up with neat black and white solutions to things. I think this is an important example and one of the key things that I've said, and we'll give examples of this today in the Mosaic Law, is that it provides examples. This is why we talk about it as paradigmatic, and I said I would explain that. A paradigm is an example of what a step forward would look like in this circumstance. So that's what we're going to look at some examples. And I'm going to look at some today. We're going to
Can I just say a step
juicy
forward?
examples.
Yes, a step forward from something that's already broken, though.
Yeah.
So I think that's
right.
a really important thing to remember is we're not starting from zero here. We're starting from a whole lot of bad stuff, and we're trying to figure out ways to try to make it better, as you say, to take a step forward. And I think it's one of the reasons why we've got to remember, and Jesus said, no one can obey the law because the law will never be enough, because how many laws do you need to write to cover every possible? So it comes down to faith,
And I think this is why this discussion is important, because we asked that question, before we settled on talking about this today. It's like, well, okay, but what do we want to get out of this? And I think what we do want to get out of it is the fact that we do come up against this kind of opposition in our everyday lives, who are people who are going, but Christianity, that's terrible laws and rules. It's sort of, that's the kind of God that you want to follow. And we could easily fall into the trap of either just go, oh, that's just Old Testament, and just brushing it away.
Yeah.
That's a rather unsatisfying kind of answer, really. Or we don't need to defend the rule itself, but it gives us an opportunity to unpack the principle and show people that the paradigm rather than the law. It actually could be a really good opportunity to point people back to the character of God and the person of God.
Yeah.
So what it points to, I think, is the fact that in complex situations, what is required is wisdom. So remember, the Bible is very wisdom focused. This is why wisdom is so important, because life is complex. And so wisdom is based in the self-revelation of God, the revealed will of God, okay, which remember, it just can't be simplified into laws. Again, it's about who we're meant to be and what God's purpose is for our lives, right? And so what does, in this very complex, broken situation, what does a step toward that look like in this circumstance? When we face circumstance like that, it's going to involve, first of all, a really good biblical understanding. So just trying to find that proof text, that verse, that rule, shortcuts are very important stage. It's actually shortcuts the application of wisdom to that, because you're essentially abdicating your responsibility to understand from the scriptures, what is God's will for me, for us, and what does it look like in this situation that's maybe always going to be partly broken? What does it mean for that situation to move a step forward? So this is what is exemplified in the Mosaic Law. So first of all, I think we need to look at the Mosaic Law in context. This is what we've said. Remember, we're dealing with a very complex context. It's a context that for us is very difficult to imagine. You actually have to work to, because remember, this goes back 3,500 years, okay? Now, that's a long time. And this is a completely different thought world, a completely different culture, which is why, I know it's the hot potato thing, isn't it? This is why it's difficult, right? But it's actually the beauty of biblical revelation, right? Because we walk in an ancient path. This goes right back. The fact that this is something ancient actually is part of what gives it its value, right? Yeah. You can see throughout Scripture that there is development in a lot of these things, right? There are things that do get left behind because there's a development in some respects.
Or because the law's achieved its purpose and shifted people's thinking culturally.
Yeah.
And we don't need
that
anymore.
Exactly. So there are, and I'm going to look at the law of Moses in the context of the ancient world and what was intelligible, what they were used to in laws at the time. So there was, in the ancient world, there was a concern for justice, because societies, they were very concerned about social order in the ancient world. Civilizations were pockets of order in the midst of chaos, and they very much feared chaos. We've said that in past episodes. We talked about that in our Thrive Deeper episode on Genesis as well. Very much preoccupied with order and chaos. So pockets of order. Now, to keep civil order, you had to have a system of justice, right? And that was kind of recognizably just that prevented revolts and problems, so there is a concern for justice in most ancient Near Eastern laws. And we do, there's some key ones that I'll quote from as we move on. There is a concern somewhat for the poor. I mean, I don't think it's quite as rigorous as it is in the Bible. Probably difference there is that in the other ancient Near Eastern laws, They're more concerned with keeping the social order as it is. This is similar, for example, in the Hindu tradition, which is a very old tradition, keeping the social strata in place, actually the caste system in place is actually quite important.
Because that is
the order, right?
That is their order.
Yeah, so it's a natural order.
There's a sense of exploitation in that, though, because you want to keep that order because it's a source of cheap labour, actually having these lower groups that
but they
are sort of subservient to the
But they saw it as natural,
classes.
though. They saw it as completely natural. You look at nature and you see, well, the lion eats the meerkat, right? Big, little, it's the powerful's
It's natural law.
right to rule, right?
It's like an entitlement in a way.
So in Plato's Republic, one of the interlocutors that's talking to Socrates, and it's written in dialogue form, the question comes up, what is justice? And, one of the guys seriously, and this was a common view at the time, says justice is the will of the strongest person. That was a very common, probably the most common idea. Justice is the will of the strongest person. So anyway, but these laws were designed to keep that social hierarchy in place because, as you say, it did serve the civilization. You needed a slave. You needed laborers.
Yeah.
They didn't have the technology that we have today. So it was dangerous work, and civilizations, in order to build walls and fortresses that protected the civilians, you needed people to be slaves, right? So
and probably the lower kind of classes of people, they probably significantly outnumbered the number of people in the higher classes. So you actually had to keep them.
You got to keep it all in place.
So care for the poor wasn't necessarily this altruistic motivation. It was about maintaining power and control. And
you've got to maintain. The poor have to be maintained,
yes,
right? Because we need them. So that was seen as a matter of natural law, and that's something to be preserved. What the Bible does is absolutely stunning. In the midst of that, it makes this stunning statement about the equality, like all people, including slaves, are children of God.
Yeah.
And their lives are sacred. So that is just, and we'll see in some examples how that actually plays out in the laws. And I mean, the other thing too is that to keep civil order, punishments are necessary, and the punishments have to be intelligible in that context. So I know
against the crime, you mean?
Again,
they have to be
proportionate. Yes, but they have to be proportionate to the crime. But they have, in the context of the culture, they have to be intelligible or recognizably harsh. Although I should say that, there's things like stoning and described in the Mosaic Law. What is interestingly absent, because for every similarity, there's a notable contrast. The sort of punishments, prolonged punishments in the ancient world, they're quite famous, actually. Assyrian, the bronze bull out. I mean, all of these terrible, terrible prolonged tortures, impalement, and all of this terrible, terrible, creative, torturous deaths that are famous in the ancient world. You get none of that in the Bible. And that's quite a contrast to its context. So none of these prolonged deaths.
Like even stoning.
That was seen to be a pretty quick way to go. Now, again, it's still designed to be a deterrent. Okay, so there's still an element of trauma to that. But this is what I mean about, like, it's recognizable. It's in that cultural context. There's an imperative to keep order, and so.
But wasn't stoning also really much more about a picture of the collective justice? We all agree, so we're all going to do our bit to punish this person.
Yeah, that's right.
Rather than one person chopping his head off and it's like, oh, you did that.
Yeah.
Was that kind of part of it as well?
That is part of it. That is part of it. So there was a reason for that particularly. But that is something that was practiced at the time. And in some senses, there are things that are imported here because they're, again, intelligible.
Yeah.
It's what's not imported that's also really notable here.
I do struggle with that. It still seems unnecessarily barbaric.
Yeah, but we need to, the remarkable thing there is, the story of Jesus with the woman that's brought to be stoned. And he says that he was without sin cast the first stone. I think it's an example of how the ideal image of what God wants is embodied in Jesus. We just need to remember that. Everything else, remember, we're dealing with a narrative here. And this is one step forward in a very harsh and messy situation. So it's actually right that you should feel that this is distasteful and abrasive to you, right? That's right. That actually, the fact that you feel that way is actually the result of the rest of the Bible. I mean, isn't it?
Yeah,
really?
totally.
It's totally like you would not feel that way if we did not have this inbuilt sense of the absolute sacredness of life.
And Jesus' model of that when he was here.
That's right. But one of the other things that is happening in the law of Moses is that God does not want to take away from the perceived seriousness of sin as well. So there's a kind of balance here. So we're not torturing people to death for days on end, as the Assyrians did, for example. But we still need to have something that symbolizes the seriousness of sin and the communal effects of the acts of one person, of the act of one person.
It just
as you've said, Stu.
It just seemed to be too harsh for things like, I don't know, was it like adultery, or it just seemed so disproportionate in comparison to other laws that seemingly.
Yeah. So the reason for that, I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because for us, when we think of adultery, we think, it's just a private, it's between those two people. And yes, I mean, I know the other people get hurt, but, they'll get over it. And it just seems, stoning seems disproportionate. Now, in these societies, when that happened, that threatened the very fabric of your society. You're thinking, we're talking tribal societies, clan-based societies, right? So if you messed with the family structure, with the family bonds, and that got messed up, it would mess up the cohesiveness of the group, which would make them vulnerable. That means which would result in chaos. Yeah. So for them to mess with those bonds was to mess with the supporting walls of a building.
Yeah.
Right. Let's just, I don't like that wall over there. I'm going to smash that wall down. No, you can't do that because the whole building is going to come falling down. So the family was the core unit of society. And if you messed with the family, if the family got broken up or disturbed, one guy's, fighting with another, because it's just, you're going to end up with chaos, and the whole group is vulnerable.
Yeah, and don't think of family as 5 or 6 people. These are hundreds of people, clans, tribes that are related or family.
But and not to harp on this, because it's not really what we're wanting to talk about, but is that then just become like an apologetic for Islam's practice today in modern culture of stoning people? Is that offered as a defense?
Well, I mean, Muslims would argue that, yes, but I would say, because remember, we're on the end of a very long process where we understand the power of that redemptive purpose of God and what that can actually do for people. And so this is, I mean, the main argument against capital punishment. I don't want to get into the capital punishment argument, but the main argument, and I think it's a very compelling one against like a death penalty, is that it doesn't give the person any chance of redemption. Because in the light of Christ, we see this redemptive purpose that anyone, no matter who they are, I mean,
and
Saul,
no matter what they've done.
Think about Saul of Tarsus, right? Who murdered Christians. And yet God turns his life around and he becomes this incredible blessing, right? I mean, if anyone ever deserved to be struck down by God, it's that guy, right? But there's redemption there in this case. So there's this principle that you have to understand the seriousness of sin before you can appreciate the marvel of grace. And a lot of what's happened, like, in the story of the flood and all these stories that seem really shocking to us and the rest, right, that are laid down to build in this sense of the utmost seriousness of sin. But as we move forwards, and particularly, in the New Testament, you get this emphasis on the purpose of God in redemption, and that everyone is, so the adulteress, go and sin no more. Yeah. They said the law says she should be stoned, right? That's kind of black and white. But Jesus has a purpose that trumps that relates to the bigger, again, talk about principles. The redemptive purpose of God is the ultimate purpose at work in the world.
And that's reflected in the New Testament, because we don't see any of that going forward in the New Testament.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
So then where does that fit when Jesus said, I haven't done away with one word of the law?
He says, I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. So,
but he said he hadn't done away with, he hasn't come to remove. any of the law.
So it's all, and this is why we're looking at this today,
Totally.
because it's all relevant, right?
Yeah.
It's just that, and you can see this because many discussions about law. What does he do? He goes back again to what is the purpose of this? Like, what does it look like to fulfill the law? And this is a good point, actually, because we're not just to keep rules. We also are actually called to fulfill the purpose of the law. To love a person or to treat a person as sacred is to fulfill the thou shalt not murder commandment was all about. It's not just about not doing something. So it's about treating human beings as sacred. And that's an inner disposition.
So it's like by Jesus saying, I haven't done away with one word of the law. He's not saying the actual legal wording, but the principles that are embodied within it. It comes back to that because clearly Jesus didn't follow the prescribed law of the Old Testament either, because he demonstrated
the Sabbath, for instance. He
argued that he fulfilled the principle of it.
Yes, the purpose.
But not the letter of the law in terms
right.
of says if someone is brought to you who's committed adultery, this is to happen to them. He didn't do that. He didn't follow the wording of it. He didn't throw away the principle. And I think that's how we would say, he hasn't done away with the word of it. The word of the law is the principle.
Yeah.
It's not the words of the law as in the rule.
That's right.
The word of the law is
the revealed will of God.
Is the principle, the revealed will.
Yeah, that's right. So let's move on then to some of the key differences. So I can summarize them.
So we're talking the differences between Old Testament law and existing ancient Near Eastern law that was already in place, in particular perhaps the Code of Hammurabi, which you're going to mention in a minute, I'm guessing.
Which was ancient Hittite laws and so forth.
Which were written around 1800 BC, and it's anticipated that the Mosaic Law was around 1400 BC.
Yeah, 13 to 1500, somewhere between there. So it's interesting to note that there's nothing like, in the ancient Near Eastern laws, nothing like love God and love your neighbor. There's nothing like that there. So, and I think that's important because that is the core. That actually is the core principle, that we need to love others. We need to honor people as sacred and honor God above all. So you don't get anything like that. I've said that other laws are class-based. They serve to maintain class order. Old Testament laws, interestingly, are trying to abolish class difference. They're actually doing the opposite, the redistribution of property. For goodness sake, like after every 49 years, the property gets redistributed back to the original share under Joshua that was shared out. So it's like, so you could not have some people having all the resources while others have none.
Which was called the Year of Jubilee, just for our listeners. Every 50 years.
Every 7 years, slaves go free.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just remarkable differences. It's just abolishing the very class differences that other laws are trying to actually preserve. So it's really doing something.
I think the other big difference, and we'll come to this with ancient Near Eastern codes, and particularly again the Hammurabi, there's a lot more eye for eye. You do this to me, I get the right to do it back to you, or someone else does it to you for me, which is, there's lots of that in those laws.
And there's much more. There is. As we've said, there is some concern for the poor for example, in the laws of Hammurabi, but most of it tends to favour the free and the wealthy. That's fairly clear. Old Testament law limits selfishness. Ancient Near Eastern laws don't. There is much greater value placed on human life in the Mosaic Law because of the principle of the sanctity of life. This is really important, both for women and for slaves who were seen as lesser. You get some quite countercultural moments in the law of Moses because it recognizes the fundamental equality. So, for example, you were not allowed to hold on to an escaped slave, whereas in all other laws, you had to return the slave. Now, just think about the implications of that. Right.
So what we're saying here, sorry, I think you might have confused your sentence then. So if you come across an escaped slave in Mosaic law, you weren't allowed to return him to his owner. But in every other law, you had to return him to his or her owner. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah. So you think about the effect that has. So it's Deuteronomy 23. This is the law. You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. Notice how emphatic this is. You shall not wrong him.
It's very countercultural.
That is just so, it's basically, that is the abolition of slavery right there.
Yeah.
So if you're a slave
and you get away
in this society, This is basically saying, yeah, you can leave whenever you want. I mean, it doesn't say it in so many words, but if he flees to another town, you have to give him a place to live wherever he chooses.
Yeah.
That is just stunningly countercultural.
But if I read this now with my contemporary eyes, it's saying you should not give up to his master as slave who has escaped from his master to you, and so on, and setting rules around how you should treat him as a slave. In my modern eyes, I would think, why doesn't it say slavery is just bad? And so
because that wouldn't.
I know
where
why.
are they going to go?
I know that, but if you look at where this is where I've said it before, when you look at these laws, are you looking back from modern times at the law, or are you looking forward? The law represents a progression of thinking. So I guess in our culture where we have very heavily enshrined ideas of human rights and strong legal systems and social structures set up, when we look back at this, it looks like a regression. But when this was written, this is a progression, a very strong.
Yeah. And the very thing that you said we have now, we have because of this. This is where it started.
And this is the power of it, of course, because it represents a change in perspective.
Yeah.
Back then.
Well, it's applying this notion of the sanctity of life. Now, here's an interesting one, right? This is Paul in the letter to Philemon.
Yes.
Right, get this. So Onesimus is a slave that has escaped, and he's come across Paul, right? Somewhere in the meantime, his master Onesimus has become a Christian as well. Onesimus, they've both become Christians. Now, Paul, interestingly, writes to Philemon, and he's sending Onesimus back. So he's actually, this is Paul, a Jew, who's actually breaking this law, but he sends him back saying, okay, I'm sending him back, and I want you to treat him like a brother.
Because he's trying to model what
he's trying to model something.
Looks like.
Now, it's interesting what he's doing, because in Roman culture, the law was you have to send a slave back. Now, Paul did not want to bring on himself any unnecessary, he didn't want to interrupt his mission with anything unnecessary, right? He didn't want to give out that, he's starting a slave revolt, because Romans were terrified, paranoid about slave revolts, right? That was a big deal in the Roman Empire. So Paul doesn't want to cause unnecessary trouble, doesn't want to give off that he's starting a slave revolt. So he says, I'm sending Onesimus back to you, Philemon. Now, you treat him like a brother. I mean, that is, Aristotle said that slaves are basically just human tools, right? So he's saying to an aristocrat, essentially, Philemon, you need to treat a slave as your equal, as your brother. And then he says, and I'd really appreciate it if you could then send him back to me. So you think, why bother with all of that? In the context, that's what I'm saying. In the context, Paul is concerned about avoiding this perception.
Yeah.
He's still wanting to uphold the principles. You see, this
and he's
is
also trying to show how Christians should behave. If his master, Philemon, had not become a Christian, we don't really know what Paul might have done in that situation, but it's like, here's an opportunity to actually show the difference that Christianity makes in our lives, both as slave, but also as master.
Yeah, that's right. Another important contrast in the law of Moses is that children could not be killed for the sins of their parents, which actually was very common in other ancient laws. So Deuteronomy 24 verse 16 says, fathers shall not be put to death for their children, nor shall children be put to death for their fathers. A person shall be put to death for his own sin. So compare this to the Code of Hammurabi, which had a law regarding when a man assaulted a pregnant woman. It says, if the woman die, his own daughter shall be put to death. And if a house collapsed, according to the law of Hammurabi, if it killed the son of the owner, then the son of that builder shall be put to death. And if a businessman beats to death a debtor who is another man's son, then if he is a freeborn man, the son of the merchant shall be put to death. So again, this is, and there's a Hittite law that says that if anyone shoves a man into the fire so that he dies, the guilty party shall give one person a son in return. So very, very common and that is completely outlawed in the law of Moses.
Interesting. Just another thing to emphasize there is that what I picked up sort of reading a bit about the law of Hammurabi from a historical perspective, it seems to be upheld quite favorably even by modern historians because of the progression of this law actually represented in the ancient world, that establishing, even though we read it now, I mean, that sounds abhorrent, what that law says, but it actually seems to get treated quite favourably, even through the lens of today's historians, because of this idea of a progression of an idea from what was, and this represents a big step forward.
Yeah.
What struck me, though, is that it is treated quite favourably, but yet when we look at the Old Testament Mosaic Law,
which when compared to it is even better. Is actually, it's almost like the Mosaic Law is barbaric and so on, and all the accusations against how bad the Mosaic Law is. It was just an interesting thing that I kind of noted, that almost like bias, like something that's really, really even more countercultural could still be favourably viewed through a modern historical lens.
Yeah. There's an interesting law in Exodus 21, and I'm just going to go through a few more examples here. Again, this is in the name of giving examples of the application of principles.
I don't like this one, Matt.
The really Exodus 21?
No.
If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life. That's a different one that you were thinking of, I think.
There's an Exodus 21 we'll probably mention. Another one. But either way.
You're thinking of another one.
Yes.
Yeah.
I thought you were go there.
Well, I will go there in a moment, so that's something for listeners to look forward to. we got some juicy
So
stuff.
let's talk about who that law was aimed at protecting.
I'm trying to, ease people in. So compare this to, Hammurabi, where if the unborn child dies, then you pay money. You have to pay a fine. But in the law of Moses, the unborn child is treated as a fully fledged human being. It's life for life, right? If someone kills the unborn child, it's murder. It's treated as murder because of the sanctity
and in fact,
of life.
Even more so in the Hammurabi, if the woman dies as well, the mother, then the daughter of the person who killed the mother is to be put to death.
In the law of Hammurabi.
In the law of Hammurabi.
Yeah, that's right. So let's go to the one that you were. I'm going to look for some juicy ones here.
Well, the one that comes back to this slave.
Let's go to some of these really juicy ones, actually. So Deuteronomy.
Okay.
We're going to go to Deuteronomy
21.
And these are some of the ones that come across to us as most objectionable. Okay. So everyone ready for this? Good.
Yes.
Hold on to your hats. Deuteronomy 21 from verse 10, when you go to war against your enemies and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands and you take captives. If you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and are attracted to her, you may take her as your wife. Bring her into your home and have her shave her head, trim her nails, and put aside the clothes she was wearing when captured. After she has lived in your house and mourned her father and mother for a full month, then you may go to her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. If you are not pleased with her, let her go, wherever she wishes. You must not sell her, and you must not treat her as a slave, since you have dishonored her. Okay. So the problem, obviously, for that is, for a start, you've taken women and children as captives. You're then marrying the woman. So I'm going to apply some important questions here.
Can I just quickly say, coming back to your slave question, this doesn't say it's okay to do all of this. This is not what this is saying.
Yeah.
But this is saying in this situation, we have to make up a rule because this is what's happening.
That's right.
How do we best protect the parties in this situation?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you're dealing with a situation that's already an absolute mess.
Yes,
this is something that happens. It's just people, when people went to war, you took captives, just what you did, right? And it was just seen as part of warfare, and there are reasons for that I won't go into now. It's just part of it, right? Now, it's not what God wants, right?
No. So he's trying to make better of a bad situation.
That's right. It's trying to make the best of a bad situation. So a good question to ask when we come to these complex laws is, who is in danger of injustice here, or who is this protecting?
Yeah.
So in this case, the person who is in danger of injustice, the person that this law is actually protecting, is the foreign woman who's enslaved, who in all other codes has no rights, really. First of all, she's given the right to mourn the death of her family. Notice it is forbidden to treat her as a slave. See, the danger really here is that these women become victims of a kind of sex trade.
Yeah.
And this is absolutely a massive no-no. Okay, it doesn't solve every problem.
No.
But this is actually a big step forward, right?
Huge step.
And I know because we think, marrying the slave and doesn't necessarily
marrying
say...
the captive. She wasn't necessarily a slave.
No, that's right. Not marrying the captive, not the slave. Thank you for that correction. So because we think about, but you should be able to choose your own partner. Very rarely in the ancient world did you choose your partner, right? You were just put together with someone, and you made
families
the best
arranged
of
it.
This is not ideal. It's not meant to be ideal. Jesus is the ideal,
yes,
right?
And that's the fulfillment, in my opinion, of the law. Because Jesus is the ideal, that's what he means when he says, I've come to fulfill it. I've come to show you what living like this, the principles of these laws,
This is
looks like.
This is trying to make a very bad situation just a bit better.
But also notice too, the reason that she's probably captive is because they've gone to war. A family is probably being killed, and there's allowed these women now who are on their own. And then they get noticed by those who have gone to war against them, and they are attracted to them. And so in that context, how do we deal with that? Do we just take them in as slaves? Do we just leave them to fend for themselves after we've wiped out their communities and so on? It just sounds abrasive, but
when you really think about it,
it kind of makes sense of what it's trying to say. You can kind of see it. It's not endorsing taking beautiful women captive.
No.
Just in case any of our listeners out there are thinking that.
It's just accepting that that's just what happens. And when that happens, this is just trying to make, as again, we'll say it again, trying to make a really bad situation, a bit better. But it's starting with a mess. Now, here's another one in Deuteronomy 22, skipping through these a little bit. If a man happens to meet in town a virgin pledged to be married, and he sleeps with her, you shall take both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. The young woman because she was in a town and did not scream for help, and the man because he violated another man's wife. You must purge the evil from among you. So I'll just stop there. There's more to this. We've already addressed the concern that you mentioned, which I think is a lot of people's concern. This seems disproportionate, right? For they should both be stoned to death. But you've got to, again, I'm going to say, remember. So the woman pledged to be married. Actually, this relates before to, that these pledges happen before, again, in a society to stop people fighting over. This is how sensitive this was, right? To stop people fighting over brides. People were pledged in marriage. So it was all understood. This woman is pledged to this man. It's all. If you don't keep the order in that kind of society with the risks that they face, if that community, if that clan fragments, it'll implode. I mean, literally life-threatening for the whole group, right? Yeah. So this is very, very serious stuff. Breaking these bonds, interrupting this order is potentially disastrous. Okay, so that's the first thing. But if out in the country...
Can we just come back one step? Sorry. Because I think there's another thing that probably many people will find a little bit offensive in the first half of that we probably need to think about. The young woman, because she was in a town and did not scream for help. It's like...
Okay, for this not to be noted, you've got to think, now when we think towns, we're not thinking, Highton, right? These close-knit towns where you are living in each other's pockets, right? Yeah. If this is not something that she wants, everyone in the town will know. You see what I'm saying? So in a sense...
But it does feel difficult for our modern sensibilities to suggest that because she didn't scream or didn't scream loud enough or whatever, she's equally to blame as the perpetrator. Let me just say that. I feel that's a challenge in today's culture.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, but again, this comes under the laws of adultery, which, as I've said, were very, very strict. In some ancient cultures, it was only ever the woman that was.
Well, even in Jesus' time, we see with the woman that was about to be stoned for adultery. Where was
the guy exactly? So and that was cultural pressure because it's got to be the woman's. Both of them. Yes. They're both culpable. But what this law actually, the interesting thing about this law, this is a law protecting the woman. It's trying to protect these cases of women who are just assumed to be guilty, which were quite common. And this is a law put in place to actually protect young women from this happening. So the thing about her crying out is that she was protected in that.
Well, that's brought out in the next verse. After that, so that kind of really gives a context.
Exactly. But if out in the country a man happens to meet a young girl pledged to be married.
So as opposed to, I'm just reminding people, the first one was if a man happens across a virgin in a town. Now it's saying, but if out in the country,
a man happens to meet a young woman pledged to be married and rapes her, only he, the man who has done this, shall die. Do nothing to the woman. She has committed no sin deserving of death. So this is presumed innocence.
Yes.
Okay? This case is like that of someone who attacks and murders a neighbor. 4, the man found the young woman out in the country, and though the betrothed woman screamed, there was no one to rescue her.
Yeah.
So it's assumed that she did.
Yes.
Presumed to be innocent, right?
Yeah.
Now, this is, again, this contrasts what else is out there. So the person in danger of injustice here, this protecting is the woman.
Yes.
I mean, we've already made comments about the importance of marriage and the coherence of society. The presumed innocence here is quite countercultural for the time.
So the presumed innocence, just again for clarity, because there's a bit going on here, even though no one witnessed necessarily whether she did or didn't scream, because she's out in the country and there's no one around, only the man would know and she would know.
That's the point of out in the country.
The point is, we're going to assume she screamed.
That's right.
And therefore she's innocent.
Yeah, and he's culpable, right?
Correct, yep. It's great.
I mean, that's...
Whereas in other cultures, it would have simply been, we don't listen to a woman's word, we only listen to a man's word.
Okay, here's another one. Deuteronomy 22, if a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married, okay, so she's not pledged to be married yet, and he rapes her and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. Now, when you read that, rough. What do you think?
I straight away think, if he's raped her, why would she even want to be married? It's almost like saying you must marry her. Why would somebody want to marry someone who did that?
Yeah.
Like, that sounds absolutely
shocking. So let's think about this. Okay, so again, we're going to ask the question, who is in danger here of injustice? Who is this protecting? It is actually a law designed to protect the woman and her family. So the problem with a rape like this is that the girl has been shamed according to that culture. So there's a loss of honor. So she actually can't be married to another
else
in that culture. And it's not that God, that's not that sort of lifting of shame.
Yeah, no,
that's something that we, that really is a result of the redemptive work of, that becomes clearer later on. But in that cultural context, that's just the way that it's going to work, right? We don't have a gospel message that's changed culture yet. Okay. So in that culture, that means that she can't be married to another. So the rapist, therefore, has to pay the bride price. Now, the bride price is her pension, essentially. It's what she lives off.
So could the father accept that or not accept that? Could he decide if he didn't want her to marry that man? Could he decide not to accept the bride price?
Well, no, he doesn't have to, but he could accept the bride price, and potentially it's assumed that actually the father has a choice, that she would not have had to marry the rapist.
Right.
But he still has to pay the bride price because she can't get remarried.
Right. With you.
So she still has to have a pension. There actually is a choice if she doesn't have to marry that person. Now, we've got to, again, you probably think, well, why would she even ever want to? I mean, you've got to remember that, again, in these small, close-knit communities, they would have known each other. They would have known each other anyway, right? And actually, in those days, in many cases, and there are stories like this in the Bible, where the girl has said, you have to marry me now.
Yes.
With the emphasis, in most cases, it was actually the case where the woman said, you have to marry, you can't leave me on my own now, because
I've got no
more important to her is that she has to be able to have children.
Yes.
The other thing in there too is, back in that culture where marriages were arranged, it wasn't even a choice for the woman getting married. It was the father's choice. So
there was some, I mean, I think it's not that there was no choice, but there was very much a respect for, and again, it's difficult for us to imagine these contexts.
You're delegating that responsibility to the father or to the parents, but I guess there's a protection mechanism in here that if that father has a choice in there, so whether he accepts it, if he felt that she was in danger with this person, he could actually block that marriage because it rests with him. So there's a bit of that potentially going on there as well.
In terms of the woman's choice, we just, again, in Thrive Deeper, we just had the situation with Rachel when they asked her, did she want to go back to meet Isaac's son? What do you want to do, Rachel? So although there was a sense of you're going back to marry him, it was like, do you want to do that, Rachel? And she was asked and she agreed to go. Yeah. So there is this balance between those two things. Now, can I just reiterate, because these things are really difficult to read in our current. This is not a law because this is a good thing. This is a law dealing with bad things that were happening, and we need to put something in place which is not going to be perfect. It's going to be the best thing we can do to try to protect the most vulnerable in this situation.
And they were designed to be workable in this culture.
Correct.
In that culture. back then.
Correct.
And not just setting an impossible law that completely went against the grain and looked completely unfamiliar to people living back then.
Totally.
There had to be some kind of link into their culture.
Man, I'm mindful of time and we want to go. I just want to, the next one I'd like, if I can just raise the Deuteronomy 24 one, because I think it's, workers and wages, because I think this paints the picture of where our current sort of social responsibility and even social laws around these things, again, we got to remember most of what we have today that we celebrate and that makes us look at these things and go, oh, that's terrible, is because what we have today has come from these principles, not these rules, but from the principles of this. So Deuteronomy 24, do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns. Pay them their wages each day before sunset because they are poor and are counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry out to the Lord against you and you will be guilty of sin. So that whole sense of treat people fairly, and equally, whether they're an Israelite or whether they're a foreigner, if they're doing their fair day's work, pay them their fair day's pay.
And you could say, well, does that mean it's wrong to have a fortnightly pay cycle, for example?
No, of course.
I mean, I've heard this. Oh, no, it says in, that you should
sunset.
have. But the fact is, in that context, people lived hand to mouth. I mean, they literally would go from work to the market to buy food
for dinner.
And that would be what they would eat that day and potentially the next morning.
Yes.
So that's how, that's how important that is. Let's just do one more because I think these are examples of where when you come across a law, just try not to overreact. Assume that there's a whole lot of contextual things that need to be thought about a little bit more. So this is the difficulty of reading these things, and there's plenty of great resources to help us with this. So Deuteronomy 25 from verse 1, when people have a dispute, they are to take it to court and the judges will decide the case, acquitting the innocent and condemning the guilty. So trial by proper trial. If the guilty person deserves to be beaten, the judge will make them lie down and have them flogged in his presence with the number of lashes the crime deserves. But the judge must not impose more than 40 lashes. If the guilty party is flogged more than that, your fellow Israelite will be degraded in your eyes. Now, when we read this, we just think, oh, that's terrible.
Yeah.
They're prescribing a flogging here. Okay, this is actually about limiting that. The other. Someone in the ancient world would think, well, that's a bit lenient. That's how, actually, in that context, that's how that would be.
We're going soft. We're going soft.
Because notice, it just takes it for granted that there are these punishments designed to underscore the seriousness, to be dissuasive for people. Yeah. That's just taken as given. Okay, this is the way we do it, but I'm going to put limits on this. So who is the person here in danger of injustice who's being protected?
A guilty person.
It's the guilty person.
Yeah.
So a guilty person is being protected here because a guilty person is still sacred in the eyes of God, right?
Yep.
And they are not to be degraded. That is remarkable. I mean, when you think, this is part of why crucifixion was so abhorrent to Jewish people, because it actually sought to degrade. It was the very opposite of all that was held sacred according to the Mosaic Law, because its purpose was to degrade the victim, whereas that was never, ever to be the case. Human dignity is still to be upheld here. So the flogging, look, in this case, the flogging was probably done with a rod, so not the, the sort of things that the Romans used. Yeah, it wasn't that sort of thing. And so basically this is a prevention of prolonged torture, which was quite common in the ancient world. Notice that it's allowed only after a trial, and the judge has to be present
to make sure about punishment, not cruelty and, as you say, torture.
This is just a few examples that we've used today.
Let me throw cat among the pigeons, Matt, because we've talked about context around all of this sort of stuff, and we've talked about the fact that, hey, we've got to remember that these were written in the context. So then let's just say we come to the New Testament and we look at some of the laws there. I think all of us have had conversations with people that say, oh, well, that was in the context then. Today, it's different. Let's, look at same-sex marriage or whatever it might be. I think we've got to remember that these laws are all written to deal with the post-fall.
Yeah.
And we know what the absolute design of God's creation was pre the fall. We've got to remember that anything from that point on is simply trying to put a Band-Aid on something that's already broken.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, they are cases where it's important that we don't, with things, so for example, with sexual ethics, that's a great example of going to Genesis 1 and 2 to see what was God's design for us in the first place. And that is the thing that we go to. It's not just individual verses. Now, there's some pretty compelling kind of verses about sexuality because it was a major concern first century. New Testament writers are really concerned about that. But they're concerned about upholding the biblical picture of the married relationship, the two halves of the whole, the man and the woman, that
and
unity
roles,
and diversity and the way that reflects the image of God. So it's upholding the unity of the difference, which is a very, important sort of biblical.
So it's important, just for me to wrap up and then hand to you guys with any summary you want. It's important to read these things not as, this is what should be happening, and therefore that's why we have this rule about it. No, this is dealing with brokenness and saying, okay, guys, if that's the way you're going to go, then let's put some boundaries around that for your protection and for everyone else's protection. It's not stating this is how it should be. So the argument where it even talks about, when your slave does this, that isn't saying we should have slaves. But it's recognizing the fact that we do because it's a broken world. And the reality is, if that's the case, how do we do our best within the limitations of humankind to put boundaries around it?
And I think some important questions to ask just to apply this is, yes, given a messy situation, what does a step forwards look like in this circumstance? It may not be ideal, but what does a step forwards look like? And to discern that, you've got to ask the question, what is the most important thing here? Now, we don't decide what the most important thing. It's not about what we want. What is the most important thing to God? And that actually is very, very clearly revealed in Scripture, right? The most important thing to God in this circumstance, that should be relatively easy to see. The application could be complex. I don't take away from that. We need to think about not just what do I want, and in our culture we can tend to be very entitled, and we've got to actually ask the question, who does God want me to become? And what does it look like to move forward to that? What does it look like to inhabit my sacred identity as a child of God? It will require some sacrifice. I may have to sacrifice what I want to step up into that. But I'm never also going to be ideal. I'm never going to be squeaky clean. I'm always going to be a work in progress. And so in different situations, and I've said this before, I think the best question you can ask is, who is God calling me to be in this situation? Who is God calling me to be? And how can I best be that?
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Thrive Perspectives. Our hope is that these discussions will challenge you to look at life from a new perspective. You'll find all our resources at the Thrive Today website, thrivetoday.tv. If there's a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please email us. Our email is contact@thrivetoday.tv. Until next time, our prayer is that you will thrive.